source says Israeli officials have concerns. They are conflicting claims on whether the pause in fighting also applies to Israel's fight against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Let's bring in CNN's Julia Benbrook live this hour in Washington. And Julia, what are you hearing about possible next steps, and what has the White House said about negotiations?
Well, Brian, as you pointed out, Pakistan's prime minister has invited delegations from the United States and Iran to Islamabad for talks on Friday. And officials have told CNN that they are preparing for the potential of talks, and that would likely include Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, as well as Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and Vice President J.D. Vance. But taking a step back here, President Donald Trump, just less than 2 hours before his deadline, he announced that he had agreed to a proposal from Pakistan for this 2-week ceasefire. And that was as his threat loomed to target Iranian bridges and infrastructure. And in his post announcing this, he said that he had received a 10-point plan from Iran. He called it a workable basis on which to negotiate. He also claimed in that the United States had already achieved and exceeded its military objectives. Now, part of his post is there on the screen now. I wanted to highlight this as he really is putting out a positive view of what these next steps will look like, making it clear that the administration is looking for an off-ramp. He said, quote, "Almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to between the United States and Iran, but a 2-week period will allow the agreement to be finalized and consummated on behalf of the United States of America as president."
Right now, we are watching the Middle East, where a 2-week ceasefire is now in effect between Iran, the United States, and Israel, after Tehran agreed to President Trump's demands. Now, Gulf states have reported new attacks this morning, but the Pentagon says our military will make sure that Iran holds up its end of the deal. And we are now learning about the possible next phase for peace. President Trump telling the New York Post this: he expects peace talks with Iran to happen in Pakistan, quote, very soon. Hello, everyone. This is Outnumbered. I'm Kayleigh McEnany here with my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Emily Campagno. Also joining us, Sandra Smith, co-anchor of America Reports, and Griff Jenkins, co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend. Well, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Raisin Kane, explained how close Iran came to total catastrophe.
You see, had Iran refused our terms, the next targets would have been their power plants, their bridges, and oil and energy infrastructure. Targets.
The United States has devastated the regime's ability to harm Americans and our interests for years to come.
Iran would be wise to find a way to get the carrier pigeon to their troops out in remote locations to know not to shoot any longer one-way attacks or missiles, because it takes time sometimes for ceasefires to take hold. We're watching it. We're prepared if necessary, but we hope and believe that it'll hold.
Iran said last night that it would allow traffic to...
He heard the love your neighbor message, but it went in one ear and right out the other, because I feel like you can't hear love your neighbor and then giddily tweet about B-52 bombers going to a country to destroy said country, because like you would acknowledge that Iranians are also our neighbors as well. They're included in that message, right? They're part of our planet and our species. Therefore, love your neighbor includes them. So you wouldn't say, yeah, love your neighbor, cool, and then go on to talk about blowing up your neighbor. It just makes no sense. Now, other conservatives as well as fundamentalist accounts also tweeted about the invocation of Christ on the moon, and they very clearly also did not listen to the actual message of the astronauts, because their underlying point was that humanity and our planet as a whole is a precious creation that we need to protect and value. But these baboon-brained dipshits heard Jesus Christ, and they only appreciated that message insofar as their own religiosity was validated, and they probably thought the libs were triggered, so it was a win for them in that regard. But they went right back to supporting the rapist pedophile in the White House's war crimes in a country that posed no threat to us. So they heard love your neighbor and thought, yeah, that's awesome, Jesus is cool, yeah, fuck Iran. I mean, how does their brain not find that contradiction? Is like there's a disconnect there. Something's not working. The wires aren't connecting in their fucking heads. But I guess, like, I don't know why they would even bother to subscribe to Christianity at all if they're just going to disregard the teachings that they don't like. What's the point? Like, it seems like they really don't care about the message of Jesus, and they only feign support for him because they think it's some sort of afterlife insurance, and they want to make sure that they don't go to hell in the event it exists. But in actuality, they very obviously couldn't give a shit about the teachings of Jesus, because their entire political project is antithetical to what he talked about. Jesus hung around with sex workers and fed the poor and commanded us to welcome the sojourners, aka immigrants, and yet Republicans make their life's mission to make the lives of all of these types of individuals as miserable as possible. So they're missing the fucking point of the message that's being shared by the Artemis II crew, which is why I think that it was in poor taste that they chose to invoke Jesus in the first place, because all it did was embolden the worst people in this country and make the rest of humanity feel excluded. But from a human perspective, I understand why they did it. They probably wanted to send a message to Americans to give them a much-needed new perspective on terms that they would be more receptive to. I get that. Not to mention, if the astronauts really are religious, they're probably clinging to their Bibles extra closely because they are in a tin can floating around the moon, after all, and they want to make sure that their souls are saved in the event they blow up. So I get it, even as an atheist. But with that being said, even though this crew consists of 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, they weren't just speaking to North Americans. They were speaking to all of humanity. 8 billion people. There are more than 4,000 different religions and 500 million non-believers, and it is incredibly tone-deaf, in my opinion, to give one religion preferential treatment. It makes the atheists and the Muslims and the Buddhists and the thousands of other religious and non-religious people feel left out, which ultimately undermines their message of togetherness. And just imagine for a moment if the astronauts were Muslim and they did the same thing. We already know what Republicans would say. Not to mention, you're invoking a religion that's being used right now to justify crimes against humanity in Iran. Our defense secretary literally believes that this is a holy war that's necessary to bring about the apocalypse. And perhaps the individuals on the receiving end of said war right now would be a little bit put off by these comments, because you're doing it for them too. This is a trip for humanity. It is the furthest that humankind has ever gone. And you have to keep these kinds of things in mind. This is supposed to be a celebration of human ingenuity, not religious dogma, because religion and supernatural beliefs didn't get them to the moon. Scientists and engineers and the most brilliant minds in the country did. So even though I genuinely think that their hearts were in the right place, using one religion, especially one that's been weaponized for wars and oppression and is being weaponized as we speak for that very purpose, it isn't necessarily a good choice if your goal really was to unite the species, which I believe that was their goal. And I've got to say it's downright offensive for a fucking scientist to promote creation, not only because it's objectively wrong, but because it tacitly furthers this idea that we're somehow special. We're not special.